Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Black Indians and Freedmen, the podcast. How are you, Dr. Christina Dickerson Cousin?
I'm great. How are you?
Doing well, thank you. All right, well, we are now in chapter 4, so let's dig right in. Explain the title of chapter 4, Ham began, to evangelize Japheth.
This was a phrase that African Methodists themselves used to explain their efforts in Indian Territory. It refers to the idea of people of African descent being descendants of the biblical figure Ham and relating to Native people being descendants of Japheth. And so this is just referencing that and trying to connect it to a biblical point of view.
Okay, makes sense. All right, in the beginning of chapter 4, you say, quote, Annie Keel, Billy Keel, and other black Indians were forced into Indian Territory in the 1830s as enslaved workers of the 5 civilized tribes. So, repeat again, who were the 5 civilized tribes, and what is a black Indian? And talk about their struggles to attain land and full citizenship.
The 5 civilized tribes include the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations. All 5 of these indigenous nations originally lived in what we now consider the southeast of the United States, places like Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, that region. And in the 1830s, because of U.S. policy, these tribal nations were forced to leave their ancestral homelands and migrate west to what was then called Indian Territory, but is now the modern day state of Oklahoma. All 5 of these tribes owned black slaves and brought those enslaved people with them as they took their forced march west, that forced march often referred to as the Trail of Tears. And so these 5 tribes, once they resettled in Indian Territory, modern day Oklahoma, their enslaved population continued to, live among them. They became fluent in indigenous languages. Many of these people had indigenous ancestry as well because of the impact of slavery and what masters would do to enslaved women. And so by the time we get to the 19th century, these are really a hybrid people, these black indigenous people. They have African ancestry, indigenous ancestry, culture, and heritage. And so these are the people who I talk a lot about in this second portion of the book, chapters 4 through 7. In terms of, can you repeat part of the question?
Yeah. Talk about their struggles to attain land and full citizenship.
Yes. So what happens is, in a nutshell, and I explain it in detail in the book, is that after slavery ends, these hybrid people, these black natives, these black indigenous people, they are, really entitled to citizenship in the tribes. That was part of what was laid out in the series of treaties that all 5 of these tribes signed after the Civil War. And so, to a varying degree, some of them were able to obtain land because as citizens of the tribes, they were entitled to that. But it's a very complex process. The process worked differently depending on what tribal nation that you're talking about. But basically, some Black indigenous people were able to obtain land, and some were able to obtain citizenship. But it is a very complex process, and it doesn't go smoothly by any means.
Okay. You state on page 83 that in 1870, Annie Keel invited the AME Church to her community in Boggy Depot to evangelize in Indian Territory. So, my question is, where was the AME Church in its development at this time in 1870?
Excellent question. So by the time we get to 1870, the AME denomination has been around for many decades. It was initially founded in 1816. So by the time we get to 1870, there has been considerable development. There are churches not only in the mid-Atlantic region, but now moving westward farther and farther, all the way out to California. There are institutions of higher education like Wilberforce University. We have this, newspaper, the Christian Recorder, which really is the newspaper of record during the Civil War and beyond. And so the AME Church has really grown to be an impressive denomination, especially considering the fact that most of its members are formerly enslaved people. It has an Atlantic world ideal. There are efforts made beyond the United States, so in the Caribbean, and we will see, throughout the century and into the early 20th century, efforts in Africa. And so the AME Church is really developing into a, global denomination, and it has these really impressive aspects on its resume. Again, Wilberforce University, the Christian Recorder, and the development of so many churches throughout the United States.
Page 87 talks about enslavement by the five civilized tribes during the Civil War. How did these tribes participate in the Civil War, and which side did they take?
This is a complex question. The governments of each of the five tribes supported the Confederacy, which may be a surprise to some people. But although the official governments of the five tribes supported the Confederacy, that doesn't mean that every single person in those nations agreed with that decision. And there were certainly individuals who supported the Union cause, who assisted with fighting in terms of that. And so as the Civil War did in states, throughout the United States, it, put people on different sides of that issue. So in part because of their vested interest in slavery, in part, the governments of the five civilized tribes supported the Confederacy, which of course will have important ramifications for when the war is over. And of course, they had backed the losing side.
Okay. All right. Speaking of the Civil War, still, beginning on page 88, you discuss how the five civilized tribes eventually signed treaties to end their enslavement of blacks as early as 1866, post-Civil War. So what was life like for the freedmen of these five civilized tribes, and what obstacles did they face?
Well, freedom, of course, was exciting for everyone. After generations of enslavement, after enduring the Trail of Tears and, all of the challenges that come along with enslavement, of course, people were thrilled. And also along with that, because of the treaties that each of the tribes signed, this also meant that Black indigenous people would become citizens of those tribes. And along with citizenship, comes recognition, rights, land rights. And so for these hybrid people, it was a great moment, an exciting moment. And we can't underestimate how significant the idea of recognition was. These were people who had, traveled on the Trail of Tears along with these indigenous nations. These are people who can speak indigenous languages fluently. I mentioned a woman in my book who only spoke the Creek language until she was about 12 years old. And many of these people, as I mentioned before, have indigenous ancestry because, indigenous slave masters would do what slave masters typically did. And so these are really a hybrid people who very much see themselves as members of these tribal nations. And so getting that recognition was important to people just on a personal level and then on a tangible level in terms of what they would now have access to.
Okay. All right. Well, we're now shifting to Annie Keel. Page 90 begins your section on Annie Keel. So what about the AME Church appealed to Annie Keel? And explain the term gospel of freedom, which you borrow, to describe what Keel saw in the Black denomination.
Well, I'll start with the gospel of freedom term that I do borrow from the renowned AME historian Reginald Hildebrand. So he talks about this idea of because of how degrading, humiliating, painful the idea, the system, the experience of enslavement had been, formerly enslaved people have to, take great strides to really correct all that had really been done wrong to them. And so part of that is, claiming their autonomy, claiming their ability to make decisions for themselves, claiming their ability to choose what denomination, for example, they wanted to belong to. And so Annie Keel, she is, very much a proponent of this way of thinking, that now that I am free, I don't have to, abide by what anyone tells me to do. I can make decisions. And one of the decisions that she makes is that she wants to be an African Methodist. I argue in the book that this is for a variety of reasons. There are numerous choices that she could have made. She could have chosen the Methodist Episcopal Church South, which was around. She could have chosen, any number of other denominations. But for her, the fact that the AME Church was an autonomous Black denomination, that it had been that way since its inception, that it had Black bishops, Black general officers, that it boasted some of the most prominent African Americans in the country at this point, people like Henry McNeil Turner, that they were, bishops in the AME Church. Well, he wasn't a bishop yet, but you understand what I'm saying. And so this appealed to her, the fact that AMEs were well known for being proponents of education. They had Wilberforce University. And so they had everything that she would have wanted. Autonomous Black denomination. They have a track record of supporting education and establishing educational institutions. You have that newspaper. You have some of the most prominent African Americans in the country belonging to this denomination. So to her, it made perfect sense that this is what she would seek out. And so I argue in the book that she chose the AME Church for those reasons.
Okay. All right. On page 91, you say, quote, Annie and the Black Indians of Boggy Depot were deeply religious people who had worshipped and prayed throughout the arduous Trail of Tears. When they settled in the Chickasaw and Choctaw nations in the 1830s, they continued their religious practices. With the assistance of their slaveholders, they built brush arbors, which were outdoor churches created from tree branches and limbs. End quote. So my question is, what role did religion play for Indians surviving the Trail of Tears? And please give us more insight on what a brush arbor is. And I can repeat these. How and why did slaveholders assist in building them?
Well, for certainly Black Indigenous people, religion was a central part of how they survived challenging times. And this is something that we see, of course, among African Americans in, any of the states where there had been slavery, that religion, as they understood it, the Christianity that they understood, the way that they adapted Christianity and the message of it to make sense to them, that was a central aspect of how they survived, how they coped with, seemingly endless, arduous, thankless labor and all of the degradations that come along with slavery. So it was a central part. There are certainly stories told that during the Trail of Tears, as these people are traveling on this forced march from their homes to the West, you could hear them singing different hymns. And certainly Black Indigenous people would have been a part of that as well. So it's not surprising then that when they make it to Indian Territory, they continue to practice their religion in the way that feels real and makes sense to them. So brush arbor churches are just, simply put, outdoor churches where you could worship, in the open air, and they could be relatively easily made. And so people who do not have, the building supplies to build a brick building, for example, a brush arbor is an easy way to make that adjustment. And so certainly during slavery, this was a practice that Black Indigenous people did, and with help sometimes from their masters. And, the connection between slave masters and the religion of enslaved people is a complex topic. Sometimes what masters wanted enslaved people to get out of Christianity was different than what the people themselves took from Christianity. But nevertheless, we do have these examples of masters assisting enslaved people in Indian territory in establishing these brush arbor churches. So the masters may have had their own idea about what they hoped enslaved people would get from that, but certainly enslaved people used the religion for their purposes and in a way that made sense to them and felt real to them.
Sure. We did touch on this earlier, excuse me, but I did want to bring it up again because you talk about it on pages 92 through 93, how Annie Keel had the choice of joining the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME Zion Church, or the Black Baptists. So did you want to just either reiterate or expand on that?
Yeah, so there are any number of denominational choices that she could have picked. And they all have, different histories. There are, plenty of African descended people who belong to the Methodist Episcopal Church South. Over time, the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, which later becomes the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, is, available, not right at that moment, but it becomes a presence in Indian territory. And I believe that people were sophisticated enough to know the differences between each denomination and to choose what they felt best fit them. So Reginald Hildebrand, who I referenced earlier, he wrote a fantastic book called The Times Were Strange and Stirring that makes this very argument that these different denominations, Methodist Episcopal Church South, Colored Methodist, AME Zion, AME, they all have their own different histories, and people are making decisions about what they want to choose. Mm-hmm. And Annie Keel, had a level of sophistication, and she knew what worked the best for her. And she felt that what the AME Church had to offer was what she was most interested in, this autonomous Black denomination that was already, pretty well established in Arkansas, which was just, down the road. So it made perfect sense to reach out to them and to avail herself, have her community be able to avail themselves of the, network of churches, the network of high-profile individuals who were AMEs, and bring those resources to bear in their own communities.
Okay. I did want to bring up two other names you mentioned on page 93. Priscilla Baltimore and Bridget Biddy Mason. So what did you want to say to give the readers more context about how these names come up?
I'm so glad you brought that up. The point I'm trying to make in this section of the chapter is that Annie Keel, who really initiates bringing the AME Church to Indian territory, she is not alone in being a woman who is initiating African Methodism. There are several women, Black women, who initiate African Methodist Episcopal congregations in their various communities. So Priscilla Baltimore, she does so in Illinois. Bridget Biddy Mason does so in California. And Annie Keel is another example of someone taking that step. So actually the research project I'm currently working on is just expanding on this idea of the really critical role that African Methodist women played in planting churches in the West, maintaining churches in the West. There hasn't even been enough written about the prominent role that African Methodist women have played in this way. And so I wanted to give a nod to that and make that clear that Annie Keel is not an outlier by initiating this contact with the AME Church and really getting the ball rolling in terms of establishing an AME presence. But really, she's a part of a whole group of women who are doing the same thing in the West.
Okay. Well, another name that comes up is Alan Wright, about whom you write on pages 93 through 95. So who is Alan Wright, and how did he assist Annie Keel in establishing an AME presence in Indian territory?
Allen Wright was chief of the Choctaw Nation for a time period, the time period that Annie Keel was, interested in the AME Church. And he himself was a Presbyterian. So it would have, made sense if Annie Keel had said, "Oh, you're a Presbyterian. I'm interested in bringing a church here. Why don't you bring the Presbyterians here?" But I think it's important to note that although he had that Presbyterian background, she very specifically said, "I want you to reach out to the AME Church on my behalf and on my community's behalf." And so Allen Wright, he reaches out to AMEs in Arkansas, which is, right nearby. That's the closest, area, and has a well-established conference there. And so in 1870, the AME Church in Arkansas starts to send ministers into Indian Territory. So in this way, these AMEs have really been invited in. This is not an example of, a church just coming in and deciding we are going to make you do this and we're going to make you convert. This is them being invited by the community and by, the chief of the Choctaw Nation to come in and, minister to these people. And so this is an important dynamic that really sets up the relationship between the AME Church and the residents of Indian Territory.
Okay. All right. So by 1878, how deep was the AME footprint in Indian Territory? What was the Indian Mission Annual Conference? And what part did AME Minister James Fitz-Sisson play in its establishment? You mentioned Sisson. You first mentioned Sisson on page 96.
By 1878, African Methodist ministers have been working in Indian Territory for almost a decade. And I give, specific statistics in the book, but essentially they are making inroads in all 5 of the tribal nations, the 5 civilized tribes in Indian Territory. So they have not only reached out to Black Indigenous people among the Choctaw and Chickasaw, but they are reaching out in various regions of Indian Territory. And they are really empowering Black Indigenous ministers themselves to help them do this. They recognize early on that, yes, we are, African Americans from Arkansas, and so we can come in and bring the church, but we really need to see, some of you and Black Indigenous ministers do this work as well. So they really work alongside Black Indigenous ministers. And I go into that more in chapter 5, but they work with them to help expand in these communities. So that by the time you get to 1878, there is already enough development that there is a call to make a separate conference for Indian Territory. So prior to that time, all of these churches were under the auspices of the Arkansas Annual Conference, because this is where these ministers were initially coming from. So by the time we get to 1878, there's enough development to justify separating these churches from the Arkansas Annual Conference and establishing their own conference. So this happens in 1879. You get the official establishment of the Indian Mission Annual Conference. And this initial meeting, sets off a whole new phase of AME development in Indian Territory. James Fitz-Allen Sisson is a really interesting figure here. He is a white man from originally Massachusetts. So he was, born in Massachusetts and then comes to the South after the Civil War to help assist, formerly enslaved people. And he joins the AME Church, becomes a minister in the AME Church. And because he is really violently attacked and threatened by white supremacists who don't appreciate the fact that a white man is working in a Black denomination, he has to really flee for his life out of Georgia and into Arkansas. And then from Arkansas, he starts going to Indian Territory, and he's really one of the founding ministers of the Indian Mission Annual Conference. And he is present at the inaugural meeting of that conference in 1879. So I talk a lot more about him in chapter 5, but that's just basically who he is.
Good transition. So what happened at, quote unquote, the meeting, at Billy Keel's home in 1879. Who was in attendance? You describe this event on page 97.
The inaugural event, establishing the Indian Mission Annual Conference officially, happens at the home of, Billy and Annie Keel, which makes perfect sense because Annie Keel was the one who initiated contact with the denomination. And so the fact that this inaugural meeting is held at their home is just indicative of the central role that they played in really making this happen, bringing this to fruition. So what happens here is what happens usually at, conferences. The bishop shows up and he gives a speech. He organizes things. He assigns ministers to different churches. He says, okay, you're going to go to the Cherokee Nation. You're going to go here. You're going to go there. And, they have just a general meeting and have, good fellowship. In attendance are both lay people and ministers. And the ministers include the really diverse clergy that have already emerged in Indian Territory. So you have African American ministers, you have Black indigenous ministers who again have, really come about and said, okay, if this is going to be a denomination in our region, we want to be a part of it. And so you have Black indigenous ministers. You have James Fitzallen Sisson, this white minister who's in the AME Church. So it's really a diverse collection of ministers in Indian Territory who come.
All right. All right. Well, our final question. Bishop Thomas Myers Decatur Ward is described on page 97 as the original trailblazer for African Methodism in California. So expand upon your quote on page 98 where you write, Ward believes that by adding Native people of various ethnicities to its ranks, the AME Church was fulfilling its purpose, which was to be a beacon of hope and a place of spiritual renewal for the oppressed.
TMD Ward was really an integral part of expanding the AME Church in the West. So he did pioneering work in California. It is then very, on brand for him to be in Indian Territory because he had such experience in the West. And he, like other African Methodists before him, he, like Richard Allen before him, views the AME Church as really a place for all marginalized people of color and really anyone else who wants to join. So to him, it makes perfect sense that, of course, indigenous people would be welcome in this denomination. Of course, formerly enslaved people among these tribes will be welcome in this denomination. That makes perfect sense. That's perfectly in line with our mission. It makes sense in terms of our expansion in the West. And so he really speaks to that at this inaugural meeting in 1879 and in the speech that he gives. And so TMD Ward really in many ways is the perfect, first bishop to have in this situation because of his appreciation for what the AME Church can be in the West. And he very much sees its expansion in the West as, a natural outgrowth and something that should be encouraged.
Okay. Any concluding thoughts on chapter 4? Any takeaways for the readers?
Yeah, so chapter 4, I believe was one of the first ones that I wrote, and it really continues to set the stage for what we'll see in the last 3 chapters. So this chapter is really just explaining how the Indian Mission Annual Conference comes to be, and gives some background information on who the people are who become members and ministers in the denomination in Indian Territory. And it really sets us up. So we have what happens in 1879. And the next chapter, chapter 5, goes right into describing the diverse ministers who work in the Indian Mission Annual Conference. So I've alluded to several. I talked about James Fitzallen Sisson briefly, this white minister in Indian Territory. And there are numerous others. And so chapter 4 really gets us the grounding in terms of how the Indian Mission Annual Conference comes to be. And it helps lead us into the next chapter that focuses on the diverse ministers.
Can't wait to read it. All right. Well, thank you. And again, we will see you for chapter 5. Thank you very much.
Thank you.